I had just signed the inheritance waiver when my sister jumped up, practically vibrating with joy, and announced she was taking her whole family out for a Michelin star celebration. Then the phone in the middle of the conference table buzzed. It was her lawyer. His voice completely panicked over the speaker. He screamed, "Do not let her sign anything. The house is a trap." My sister froze, her celebratory smile melting into pure horror. I just sat back and smiled. My name is Naomi. I am 33 years old and I work as a forensic accountant. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had a toxic family member try to manipulate you out of what is yours. The tension in Mr. Donovan's upscale law office was thick enough to choke on. The room smelled of lemon polish, expensive leather, and the overwhelming scent of my brother-in-law Jamal's designer cologne. We were gathered around a massive mahogany conference table to settle my late father's estate. The morning sun glared through the floor-to-ceiling windows, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air and the beads of sweat forming on Jamal's forehead. Mr. Donovan sat at the head of the table, his hands folded neatly over his legal pad, maintaining a rigid professional neutrality. My older sister Stephanie sat across from me, meticulously adjusting the strap of her luxury handbag, projecting the image of the perfect wealthy suburban wife. Next to her was Jamal. He was 36 years old, a tall and imposing African-American man who loved to introduce himself as a high-rolling venture capitalist. He wore a custom-tailored suit that looked sharp, but I noticed the slight fraying at the cuffs. Mr. Donovan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. As the executive of my father's estate, he was legally bound to remain neutral. But the tight line of his jaw revealed his distaste for Jamal's aggressive behavior. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner of the office seemed to amplify the heavy silence in the room. Every second that passed felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. Jamal cleared his throat, a sound designed to command the room, and picked up a thick stack of stapled papers. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the document across the polished mahogany wood. It slid rapidly, coming to a halt just inches from my coffee cup. It was a formal inheritance waiver. I looked down at the legal document and then back up at Jamal. He leaned forward. "Naomi." He began using that condescending tone he always reserved for me. "Let us have a conversation about real-world finance. You are a smart woman, but you do not understand how wealth accumulation works." I kept my face blank, letting him talk. He took my silence as submission and continued his lecture. "Stephanie and I need the estate," he declared, tapping his expensive pen against the table. "We have 3 children to put through private school and an image to maintain. More importantly, I need the $4 million mansion to serve as collateral to expand my venture capital firm. My firm is scaling rapidly, and locking up a liquid asset like that house in probate, or splitting it with you, would be a catastrophic financial mistake for the family legacy." He spoke about the family legacy as if he had built it himself conveniently, ignoring the fact that my father had worked 60-hour weeks for 40 years to buy that Beacon Hill property. Jamal shifted in his leather chair, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Be realistic. Naomi, look at your life. You are 33 years old. You are single. You rent a tiny apartment downtown. What on earth are you going to do with a $4 million mansion? You do not host charity galas or entertain business partners. You do not even have a husband to help maintain the property." He scoffed. "And let us be honest about your career," he added. "Forensic accounting is just glorified bookkeeping. You sit in a cubicle and look at spreadsheets all day. You are not making moves. You are not closing deals. You do not need capital." Stephanie chimed in, placing a manicured hand on Jamal's arm. "Jamal is right. Naomi, you have to think about the bigger picture. We are building an empire for the kids. You just have yourself to worry about. It would be incredibly selfish of you to hold our future hostage over a house you cannot even afford to furnish properly." I touched the edge of the inheritance waiver. Jamal saw my movement, and his eyes lit up with greedy anticipation. He pointed to another much thinner folder sitting off to the side of the table. "We are not leaving you empty-handed," he said. "Dad left behind that rural limited liability company and the barren land attached to it. It is entirely yours. We do not want to be greedy. Take the dirt. Naomi, it suits your lifestyle perfectly. It requires zero business acumen to manage. Just sign the waiver for the house, and you can walk away with your little piece of the countryside." I looked at the waiver, then at the supposedly worthless rural deed. As a forensic accountant, my entire career revolved around finding hidden truths, unmasking corporate fraud, and following the money trails that arrogant men like Jamal desperately tried to conceal. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought their aggressive tactics and cruel insults would force me to submit and sign away my birthright without a second thought. But they had no idea who they were truly dealing with. The silence stretched across the conference room for another long minute. I kept my eyes locked on the thick stack of legal papers resting on the mahogany table. As a forensic accountant, my brain is permanently wired to scan for anomalies, hidden liabilities, and the invisible traps that greedy men leave behind in their paperwork. My index finger traced the edge of the first page. I very carefully noted the specific legal statutes referenced in the fine print, the transfer of liability clauses, and the exact phrasing Jamal had his lawyers use to ensure the estate was handed over in its entirety. My lack of immediate compliance was driving my mother crazy. Beatrice sat directly next to my sister Stephanie, her posture rigid and her hands tightly clutching her expensive designer purse. She had always hated my silence. To Beatrice, silence meant defiance. She preferred compliance, loud agreements, and total submission to the family narrative she had spent decades cultivating. When my father was alive, she played the role of the beautiful, supportive wife. But now that he was gone, she had seamlessly transitioned into the fierce protector of Stephanie and Jamal's flawless suburban image. Naomi stopped playing these little games and signed the paper. Beatrice snapped. Her voice cut through the quiet room like a serrated knife. "You are doing that thing again. That stubborn, analyzing thing you always do when you want to make everyone else uncomfortable. Just stop it." I slowly looked up from the document and met my mother's gaze. "I am reading a binding legal contract regarding our father's estate," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level. "It is standard practice to read what you sign," Beatrice scoffed, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. "Standard practice for who? For your little accounting job. This is Family Naomi. We are not some corrupt corporation you are investigating. We are your blood, and right now your blood needs you to stop being so deeply selfish." "Look at your sister," Beatrice commanded, gesturing grandly toward Stephanie. "Look at what she has built. Stephanie has a powerful husband. She has 3 beautiful children who need space to grow. They have a reputation to uphold in their community, the country club, the private school tuitions, the charity board she serves on. They need that house to anchor their social standing. It is essential for Jamal's business network." Beatrice leaned forward, pointing a manicured finger at me. "Now look at yourself. You are 33 years old. You are entirely alone. You have no husband to provide for you. You have no children to worry about. You live in a rented apartment in the city. Tell me, Naomi, what business does a single woman renting a 2-bedroom apartment have with a $4 million historical estate? It would be a complete waste. You would probably just sell it and hoard the cash for yourself. Your sister has real responsibilities," Beatrice continued, her voice dripping with fake pity. "She has carpools and galas and a husband who operates in the highest tiers of finance. You balance spreadsheets for a living. You can take your little laptop and work from anywhere. You do not need a permanent anchor like the Beacon Hill house. The Rural Limited Liability Company is perfectly fine for you. You can go out there, look at the empty dirt, and pretend you inherited something grand. but leave the real assets to the adults who know how to leverage them. Mr. Donovan cleared his throat. Beatrice, please. Naomi has the legal right to take her time reviewing the waiver. It is only a significant decision if she intends to be difficult. Jamal interrupted, crossing his arms over his chest. And we all know Naomi loves to be difficult. It is her only personality trait. I looked back down at the waiver. My eyes scanned the second paragraph. Specifically, a clause regarding the assumption of all attached debts, liens, and encumbrances associated with the property. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs. They had no idea that I already knew exactly what they were trying to do. They had no idea that I had spent the last 3 days running background checks on Jamal's supposedly booming venture capital firm. Beatrix slapped her hand on the table, startling Mr. Donovan. Naomi, I am losing my patience. Your father would be so disappointed in you right now. He wanted this family to stay together. He wanted his grandchildren to have that house. If you refuse to sign that paper, you are not just stealing from your sister. You are spitting on your father's final wishes. I will never forgive you, and you will never be welcome at my dinner table again. Just sign the paper. Her ultimate threat. Excommunication from the family. For years. That threat had kept everyone in line. It was the emotional blackmail she used to control the narrative and keep Stephanie elevated as the golden child. She expected me to crumble. She expected the fear of being unloved to force my hand. I let out a very slow, measured breath. I looked at Jamal's arrogant smirk at Stephanie's greedy, expectant eyes, and finally at my mother's furious, demanding glare. They wanted me to surrender. They wanted me to take the barren dirt and leave them with the crown jewel of my father's estate. They thought they had orchestrated the perfect heist, using emotional abuse as their primary weapon. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer, my fingers wrapped around the cool metal of my Mont Blanc pen. I did not argue. I did not defend my career, my apartment, or my single status. I simply pulled the pen out, removed the cap with a very soft, satisfying click, and brought the nib down toward the signature line at the bottom of the page. The trap was perfectly set, and they were all practically begging me to spring it right now. I held the MLANC pen between my thumb and index finger, feeling the familiar, reassuring weight of the silver barrel. I had used this exact pen to sign off on investigations that had sent corrupt corporate executives to federal prison. Today, I was using it to sign away a $4 million estate to my sister and my brother-in-law. The sheer irony of the moment was almost too delicious to keep to myself, but I maintained my absolute composure. Beatrice let out a sharp, impatient breath, clearly annoyed that I was taking my time. Just sign it. Naomi, she hissed, her voice tight with suppressed anger. Do not drag this out any longer than you already have. I lowered the nib to the thick cream-colored paper. I wrote my full name on the signature line, the ink flowing smoothly, sealing the transfer of the Beacon Hill mansion and all its associated liabilities directly to Stephanie and Jamal. Then, for good measure, I added my initials to the bottom of each preceding page, exactly as Mr. Donovan had instructed. As soon as the pen lifted from the final page, Stephanie practically launched herself across the mahogany table. She snatched the entire stack of documents with a triumphant, greedy gasp, clutching the papers to her chest as if they were winning lottery tickets. Her eyes were wide, shining with an intense manic excitement. "We did it! Jamal!" she squealed, bouncing slightly in her expensive leather chair. She turned to her husband, her face radiant with victory. "The house is ours. We officially own the Beacon Hill estate." Jamal let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the wood-paneled walls of the law office. He leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head, the absolute picture of a man who believed he had just outsmarted everyone in the room. "I told you, babe," he said. winking at Stephanie. I always close the deal. The venture capital portfolio is going to look incredible with this asset attached. Beatrice exhaled a long, dramatic sigh of relief, placing a hand over her heart. "Thank goodness," she murmured, offering a tight, forced smile in my direction. "You finally did the right thing." Naomi. Your father would be relieved that this family is staying united. This house is exactly what Jamal needs to take his firm to the next level. I did not respond. I simply capped my pen and placed it back into the inner pocket of my blazer. I watched them celebrate their victory, analyzing their body language. They were completely blinded by greed. They had been so focused on acquiring the $4 million asset that they had completely ignored the fundamental rule of any forensic audit, which is to always follow the debt. Stephanie was already pulling her iPhone out of her designer purse, her thumbs flying across the screen. "I am booking a table at Lerner Den for tonight," she announced to the room, not even bothering to look at me. "We are going to celebrate properly. Jamal, make sure you text your partners. Let them know the capital expansion is officially a go." Jamal nodded, pulling out his own phone. "Absolutely. This is going to fast-track our entire operation." He paused, then turned his gaze back to me. His expression was a mix of pity and extreme arrogance. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany table. "Look, Naomi," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I know this must be a little difficult for you to swallow. It is hard to walk away from a prime asset like that. But you have to understand how high-level finance works. You need leverage to make real money, and you just do not have the portfolio or the lifestyle to maximize a property like Beacon Hill." He offered me a fake sympathetic smile. But hey, we are family. If your little accounting job ever hits a rough patch, or if you need a small personal loan to cover your rent downtown, you know where to find me. My firm is always willing to help out the less fortunate relatives. Stephanie laughed a high, sharp sound. "Oh, stop it. Jamal, she will be fine. She has the Rural Limited Liability Company. She can go out there and look at the dirt on the weekends." Beatrice joined in, a soft, approving chuckle escaping her lips. "It is the perfect arrangement," she agreed. "Stephanie and Jamal get the legacy estate, and Naomi gets the quiet countryside. Everyone wins." Mr. Donovan sat at the head of the table, his face completely pale. He had been reviewing the final pages of the signed waiver, and he clearly understood the legal gravity of what had just occurred. He looked at me, his eyes wide, with a silent question, asking if I truly comprehended the trap I had just willingly stepped out of, and the trap I had just allowed my sister to step into. I met the lawyer's gaze and gave him a single, nearly imperceptible nod. I knew exactly what I was doing. I slowly stood up from the conference table, smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. I looked at Jamal, who was still grinning like he had won the Super Bowl. I looked at Stephanie, who was busily confirming her reservations at a Michelin star restaurant. And I looked at my mother, who was radiating pure, toxic satisfaction. "I hope you enjoy the house." "Jamal," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion. "I really do. I hope it brings you exactly what you deserve." I offered them a single cold, calculating smile. It was the kind of smile I reserved for the final moments of a corporate investigation right before the federal indictments were unsealed. They were currently celebrating a $4 million windfall, completely unaware that they had just legally chained themselves to a ticking financial time bomb. I picked up my leather briefcase, turned on my heel, and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the office, waiting for the inevitable explosion. I was halfway to the heavy oak doors of Mr. Donovan's office when the sharp, intrusive ring of a desk phone sliced through the celebratory atmosphere. Jamal had just pulled a bottle of Dom Perignon from his designer briefcase, a presumptuous and incredibly tacky move for a legal meeting, and was working the cork. Stephanie was holding out 2 crystal flutes she had apparently brought with her, giggling as the cork began to yield. The ringing phone stopped them both. Mr. Donovan, looking relieved for the interruption, reached across his desk and pressed the speaker button. Donovan here, he said, his voice tight. Sir, it's Peterson, the voice of Mr. Donovan's junior partner blasted through the speaker, frantic and breathless, as if he had sprinted up several flights of stairs. Are they still there? Have they signed the paperwork? Jamal paused, his hands still gripping the champagne bottle, a slight frown creasing his forehead. Stephanie lowered the crystal fluts, her laughter dying in her throat. My mother. Beatrice sat up straighter, sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy. I stopped with my hand hovering over the brass door handle, turning slowly back to face the conference table. Yes, Peterson, we are concluding the meeting now. Mr. Donovan replied carefully, glancing at me and then at Jamal. The waiver has been signed. No. Peterson practically screamed through the speaker, the audio distorting slightly from the volume. You have to stop it. Don't let Naomi sign the waiver. You have to rip it up right now. The room fell dead silent. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Jamal's confident posture dissolved instantly. The smug, arrogant grin vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Stephanie's hands began to tremble. One of the crystal flutes slipped from her fingers, hitting the edge of the mahogany table and shattering into a dozen sharp, glittering pieces on the Persian rug. The sound of breaking glass was violently loud in the quiet office. Peterson calmed down. Mr. Donovan commanded his professional demeanor, slipping. What are you talking about? What is the issue with the waiver? It's the house. Sir. Peterson gasped, his voice vibrating with terror. The Beacon Hill property. I was doing the final deed recording check with the county clerk, and I found something. It was buried under a shell company layer, heavily obfuscated. But it's there. Beatrice stood up, her face draining of color. Found what, she demanded, her voice shrill. What is wrong with the house? It's a trap, Peterson yelled through the speakerphone. The whole estate is a financial death trap. Whoever takes ownership of that mansion is going to be ruined. The cork on the Dom Perignon bottle finally gave way with a loud, hollow pop, echoing the sudden catastrophic explosion of their perfect plan. The champagne foamed over the top of the bottle, spilling sticky, expensive liquid all over Jamal's tailored suit pants and the pristine mahogany table. He didn't even notice. He just stared at the speakerphone, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in him before. Explain yourself, Peterson, Mr. Donovan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. What exactly did you find on the deed? I watched the color completely drain from my sister's face. Stephanie looked at her husband, seeking reassurance, seeking that arrogant confidence he had displayed just moments ago. But Jamal was paralyzed. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine, and he had already heard the click. I can't say it over an unsecure line, sir, Peterson said, his voice trembling. But it's bad. It's incredibly bad. If Naomi signed that waiver, she just handed over the worst financial liability I've ever seen in a probate case. Whoever holds the title to that house is going to face immediate aggressive collection actions. And, sir, I think the lenders are connected to organized crime. Beatrice gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Stephanie let out a choked, terrified sob. Jamal finally moved, slamming the champagne bottle down onto the table so hard I thought the glass would shatter. He lunged toward Mr. Donovan's desk, his face contorted in a mix of rage and desperate fear. Hang up the phone, Jamal roared, reaching for the console. Hang it up right now. Mr. Donovan swiftly moved his hand over the receiver, blocking Jamal. Step back. Mr. Vance, the lawyer warned, his voice hard. You are in a law office. Do not touch my equipment. I slowly walked back toward the conference table, My leather briefcase held firmly at my side. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had completely inverted. 10 minutes ago, I was the pathetic single spinster being bullied into giving up my inheritance. Now I was the only person in the room who wasn't currently hyperventilating. "It seems," I said, my voice cutting through the panic like ice, "that your venture capital expansion plan has hit a slight snag." Jamal. Jamal whipped his head around to look at me, his eyes wide, wild, and bloodshot. "You knew," he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You knew about this." I didn't answer him directly. I didn't need to. I simply walked over to the chair I had previously occupied and placed my briefcase back on the table. The sharp, clean sound of the brass latches clicking open cut through the chaotic energy of the room. They had wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial manipulation, using emotional abuse and familial pressure to force my hand. They thought they were the predators and I was the easy prey. They were wrong. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the thick, meticulously organized stack of audited financial records I had compiled over the past 3 days. It was time to show them exactly why forensic accounting was not just glorified bookkeeping. It was time to show them the trap they had so eagerly, so greedily locked themselves inside. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock and the ragged sound of Jamal's breathing. I reached into my briefcase, the polished brass latches snapping open with a decisive sound that seemed to echo in the stillness. I withdrew a thick, meticulously organized stack of documents. These were not simple printouts. They were the culmination of a 72-hour forensic deep dive, a comprehensive audit that had stripped away every layer of Jamal's carefully constructed financial facade. I placed the stack deliberately in the center of the mahogany table, right next to the puddle of spilled champagne. "You see, Jamal." I began, my voice steady and commanding. "The problem with treating your family like a hostile takeover target is that you assume you are the smartest person in the room. You assumed that because I'm a forensic accountant, I only deal with boring spreadsheets. But my job is to find the money that people like you try very hard to hide. And when you pushed so aggressively for the Beacon Hill estate, I decided to take a look at why a supposedly successful venture capitalist would be so desperate for a single residential asset." I slid the first file folder across the table toward him. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake, making no move to touch it. Stephanie, still clutching her shattered champagne flute, leaned forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and mounting dread. "Let us talk about your venture capital firm." "Vanguard Innovations," I said, tapping the cover of the folder. "You love to tell everyone about your rapid scaling and your high-yield portfolios. You use words like leverage and capital expansion to impress my mother and intimidate anyone who asks too many questions. But Vanguard Innovations ceased being a functional entity 24 months ago." "That is a lie." Jamal choked out, his voice hoarse. He looked wildly at Mr. Donovan. "She is lying. She is trying to sabotage the estate transfer." I opened the folder, revealing a series of officially stamped documents. "These are the bankruptcy filings from Delaware," I stated calmly. "Vanguard Innovations filed for Chapter 7. Liquidation 2 years ago after your primary tech investment turned out to be a vaporware scam. Your firm lost everything. You lost your investors' capital. You lost your operating funds, and you lost your credibility in the legitimate financial sector." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "Jamal, what is she talking about?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "You just told us last week about a new tech merger." He lied. "Mother," I said, not taking my eyes off Jamal. He has been lying for 2 years to maintain the illusion of success. The luxury cars, the country club membership, Stephanie's designer wardrobe. It is all a facade, but maintaining that facade requires capital. And when the legitimate banks cut you off, Jamal, you had to find alternative sources of funding. I slid the second folder across the table. This one was thicker, filled with complex flowcharts and transaction logs. This is where the forensic accounting gets interesting, I continued. I tracked the liquidity keeping your lifestyle afloat. It is a classic shell game. You set up a network of offshore LLCs moving money through holding companies in the Caymans and Cyprus to obscure the origin. But the origin is not venture capital. It is high-interest predatory debt. Stephanie was staring at Jamal, her face a mask of horror. Jamal, tell her she is crazy, Stephanie pleaded, her voice trembling. Tell her she does not know what she is talking about. Jamal opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was staring at the flowcharts, his eyes tracking the meticulously documented trail of his financial ruin. You have been borrowing from entities that do not operate within the bounds of standard regulatory compliance, I explained, leaning slightly forward. Shadow lenders, the kind of creditors who do not care about your credit score, but who demand exorbitant interest rates and absolute collateral. You have been cycling debt, paying off one predatory loan with another, drowning deeper every month just to keep up appearances. I flipped to a page detailing a series of massive wire transfers. 6 months ago. The music stopped. Your shadow lenders called in their notes. You are facing complete financial exposure and likely severe personal consequences. You needed a massive infusion of clean, liquid capital immediately to pay them off. But you had no assets left to leverage. Your own house is mortgaged to the hilt, and your business accounts are empty. I looked at my mother, whose face had gone perfectly slack with shock. That is when you realized my father was dying, I said, my voice dropping to a hard, unforgiving register. That is when you realized there was one unencumbered asset left in the family that could save you. The Beacon Hill estate. You needed the house. I continued, turning my attention back to Jamal, who was now sweating profusely. Not to live in, not for your children, and certainly not to expand a non-existent venture capital firm. You needed it as the ultimate collateral to appease the syndicate you owe money to. You needed to own it free and clear so you could immediately leverage it to save yourself from total destruction. I sat back in my chair, gesturing to the stack of documents. That is the real-world finance you wanted to lecture me about. Jamal. A hollow empire built on predatory debt and desperate lies. And you were perfectly willing to manipulate this entire family to use my mother's vanity and my sister's greed just to secure the only life raft you had left. But you made one critical error. You assumed you could outsmart the one person in this room whose actual profession is catching fraudsters like you. I watched Jamal's face morph from a mask of arrogant superiority into a portrait of absolute terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, raspy breath escaped his throat. Stephanie, however, was not ready to surrender her delusion. She slammed her hand against the table, careful to avoid the shattered crystal glass, and glared at me with wild, desperate eyes. You are making this up, Stephanie shrieked, her voice cracking under the strain of her collapsing reality. You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of my life, of my husband, of our success. Jamal would never do something like that. He manages millions of dollars. He is a provider. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I simply reached into the final compartment of my leather briefcase and extracted a single heavily redacted legal file bound in a red folder. This was the kill shot. This was the exact piece of evidence that had caused Mr. Donovan's junior partner to scream over the speakerphone just moments ago. I placed it gently on the mahogany surface right in front of Mr. Donovan, who stared at it as if it were a live grenade. Let us review the timeline of our father's final days, I said, my tone shifting from analytical to icy. 6 months ago. His pancreatic cancer reached stage 4. The pain management protocol escalated rapidly. The hospice nurses had him on a continuous heavy dose of morphine and fentanyl. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, barely able to recognize his own children. He was incapacitated, highly vulnerable, and completely dependent on his family for protection. Beatrice let out a small, wounded whimper, pressing her knuckles against her mouth. The memory of my father's decline was painful for all of us, but for Jamal, it had represented a golden financial opportunity. You visited him at the hospice facility every single Tuesday afternoon. I continued locking my eyes onto Jamal's profusely sweating face. You told Mother you were going there to read to him to give her a break from sitting by his bedside. She thought you were being a devoted, caring son-in-law. But you were not reading to him. Jamal, you were waiting for the nurses to leave the room. You were waiting for those brief, terrible windows when the medication clouded his mind just enough to make him compliant, but left him awake enough to hold a pen. I opened the red folder and slid a copy of a promissory note across the table. It was densely packed with legal jargon, but the signatures at the bottom were starkly clear. One belonged to Jamal. The other was a jagged, shaky scroll that barely resembled my father's usually precise and elegant handwriting. "This is a collateral assignment and security agreement," I explained, pointing to the shaky signature. "You brought a notary with you. A notary whose license I recently discovered was revoked last month for participating in a massive real estate fraud ring. You propped a dying, heavily medicated man up in his hospice bed and guided his hand to sign away the title of the Beacon Hill mansion. You coerced him into pledging his only major unencumbered asset as collateral for your underground debts." Stephanie let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. She looked at the signature, her eyes tracing the fragile, terrified handwriting of our dying father. "Jamal," she whispered, her voice hollow and trembling. "Tell me this is fake. Tell me she forged this." Jamal stared straight ahead, his eyes glazed over, completely unresponsive. He knew the game was over. "It is not a standard bank loan," I elaborated, leaning back in my chair and addressing the room at large. "Banks require income verification credit checks and ethical compliance. Jamal could not pass any of those tests. The entity that issued this loan operates entirely in the shadows. They are a predatory syndicate that targets desperate individuals who have been locked out of the traditional financial system. Their business model relies on exorbitant interest rates, brutal enforcement tactics, and seizing high V-value collateral when their victims inevitably default." I turned to Mr. Donovan, who was reading the document with a look of pure professional horror. The junior partner, Peterson, found the lien recorded under a nested shell company registered in Wyoming. I told the lawyer. They buried it deep, waiting for the estate to enter probate. They knew the father was dying, and they knew the house would soon transfer ownership. They were just waiting for a wealthy, unsuspecting heir to take the bait. I shifted my gaze back to Stephanie, whose perfect suburban facade had completely shattered. "You wanted a lesson in real-world finance, Stephanie. So let us do the math together right now. The Beacon Hill estate was appraised last month at exactly $4 million. It is a beautiful property, a true legacy asset. However, the principal amount Jamal borrowed from the syndicate was $3.5 million. I paused, letting that number sink in, watching the blood drain completely from my mother's face. But that was 6 months ago. I continued relentlessly. Predatory loans carry predatory terms. The compounding interest, the hidden fees, the aggressive default penalties that triggered the moment Jamal's fake venture capital firm missed its first payment 3 months ago. All of that has been piling up. As of this morning, the total debt attached to the Beacon Hill mansion as an inescapable, legally binding lien is exactly $4.5 million. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the silent room. Stephanie's mouth hung open. She was trying to process the numbers, trying to fit them into the narrative of wealth and power she had believed in for so long. "Do you understand what this means?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. The house is worth $4 million. The debt attached to it is $4.5 million. The estate does not have a positive net worth. It has a negative $500,000 equity. It is not a crown jewel. It is a massive, crushing financial liability. And the creditors holding that note are not going to send polite letters in the mail. They are going to come for the property, and they are going to come for the people who hold the title. Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless cry, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table to steady herself. Her eyes darted frantically between me, the documents, and her golden son-in-law. The man she had praised, the man she had allowed to demean me, had secretly destroyed the family's financial security while standing over her husband's deathbed. Jamal had used the father's life's work as a poker chip to cover his own catastrophic failures. He had knowingly set a trap, intending to hide behind the estate's clean reputation to buy himself more time with dangerous criminals. And now you own it, I said, delivering the final crushing blow. By forcing me to sign that waiver, you successfully claimed the entire estate for yourselves. You wanted the mansion. Stephanie, you fought for it. You insulted me for it. You celebrated acquiring it. And now you own a $4.5 million debt to an underground syndicate. Congratulations on your inheritance. The reality of the situation crashed over them with the force of a tidal wave. The illusion of the venture capital empire. The country club status. The wealthy suburban life. All of it evaporated in an instant, leaving behind nothing but the terrifying specter of insurmountable debt and impending criminal retaliation. The room was no longer a place of celebration. It was the epicenter of their absolute ruin. Stephanie stared at me, her chest heaving as her manicured nails dug into the expensive leather of her chair. The manic joy that had illuminated her face just minutes ago had completely vanished, replaced by a hollow, frantic desperation. She looked at Jamal, expecting her powerful husband to fix this, to wave his hands and declare it all a massive misunderstanding. Jamal remained utterly frozen. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. The man who loved to dominate boardrooms was reduced to a hyperventilating shell, his eyes darting toward the heavy oak doors, as if calculating his chances of escaping the country. Beatrice let out a high-pitched keening sound. She clutched her pearl necklace, her knuckles turning white. "This cannot be happening," my mother gasped, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "You are making a mistake. Naomi, you have misread the documents. Jamal is a respectable businessman." I did not bother addressing my mother's pathetic denial. My gaze remained fixed on my sister. I watched the exact second the primal animalistic panic overrode Stephanie's suburban country club conditioning. She looked down at the mahogany table. Her eyes locked onto the physical inheritance waiver sitting innocently next to my leather briefcase, the paper bearing my fresh, wet signature in black Mont Blanc ink. In her mind, that single piece of paper was the only thing binding her to a $4.5 million underground debt. If the paper ceased to exist, the nightmare would suddenly end. With a sudden, violent shriek, Stephanie launched herself out of her chair. She lunged across the wide conference table, knocking over her empty coffee cup and sending a cascade of paperwork fluttering to the floor. Her designer dress caught on the armrest, but she ignored the tearing fabric. Her manicured hands clawed desperately toward the waiver. She was not a poised suburban mother anymore. She was a cornered animal trying to destroy the trap that had just snapped shut around her ankle. "Tear it up, Jamal," Stephanie screamed, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Tear it up right now. We did not accept it. The deal is off. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice." I simply slid my hands smoothly across the polished wood and pulled the document away a fraction of a second before her manicured claws could rake across it. Stephanie slammed chest first onto the hard mahogany surface, her hands slapping uselessly against the empty space where the paper had been. She let out a frustrated guttural cry and scrambled to push herself back up, preparing to lunge at me again. "Sit down." "Stephanie," I commanded, my voice dropping to a hard, authoritative register that demanded absolute compliance. Destroying this piece of paper will not save you. You are fighting a ghost. I calmly picked up the physical waiver, folded it neatly in half, and tucked it into the inner pocket of my blazer, while Stephanie stared at me in breathless, sweaty confusion. I reached back into my briefcase. I did not pull out another folder. Instead, I pulled out my sleek silver tablet. I tapped the screen to wake it up and turned the bright high-resolution display toward my sister and her paralyzed husband. "Welcome to the 21st century of forensic accounting and legal filings," I said, tapping the center of the screen. Did you really think a professional investigator would rely on a single piece of vulnerable paper in a room full of hostile, greedy people? That physical document was merely a prop. It was a courtesy copy printed for your viewing pleasure. I zoomed in on the screen, ensuring the bold green text at the top was perfectly legible to everyone in the room. 10 minutes ago, before I even took the cap off my pen, I accessed the secure, legally binding electronic signature portal linked directly to the state registry office. I explained, watching the remaining color drain from Jamal's face. I executed my digital signature using my certified public accountant credentials. The waiver of inheritance was time-stamped, cryptographically sealed, and instantly submitted to the county probate court. It was legally binding the moment I tapped submit. My physical signature on that paper was just me providing you with a souvenir. Mr. Donovan leaned over his desk, his eyes scanning the digital confirmation receipt displayed on my tablet. He let out a long, heavy breath and slumped back into his chair. "She is right," the lawyer murmured, his voice filled with professional resignation. "The filing is complete. The digital trail is absolute. Naomi has officially and irrevocably disclaimed all interest in the Beacon Hill estate." Stephanie slowly slid off the table, collapsing back into her chair like a puppet with its strings cut. She looked at Jamal, her eyes wide with terror. "What does that mean?" she whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Jamal, what did she just do?" Jamal swallowed hard, his throat moving convulsively. He looked at the floor, unable to meet his wife's eyes. "It means she is out," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "She is out and we are holding the bag." "Allow me to clarify exactly what you are holding," I said, silencing the room once again. "By legally disclaiming my interest, my 50% share of the estate automatically transfers to the next primary beneficiary in line. That is you. Stephanie, you and Jamal are now the sole undisputed legal owners of the Beacon Hill mansion. You got exactly what you demanded. You won the house." I placed my hands flat on the table, leaning forward to deliver the final crushing reality of their situation. However, I continued relentlessly inheriting the asset means you instantly inherit all liabilities attached to it. The syndicate that issued the shadow loan to Jamal built a very specific acceleration clause into that promissory note. It states that upon the transfer of the title from the original owner, the entire balance of the loan becomes immediately due. They do not want to deal with probate courts. They do not want to negotiate with heirs. They want their money the second the deed changes hands. I paused, letting the silence amplify the magnitude of their destruction. By forcing me to sign that waiver today, you triggered that acceleration clause, I stated, locking eyes with my sister. You did not just inherit a house. You inherited an immediate legally binding and highly dangerous obligation to pay off a $5 million debt. And because you are now the sole owners of record, those shadow creditors are not going to bother with my father's estate lawyers. They are going to come directly to your house in the suburbs. They are going to look at your luxury cars, your country club memberships, and your children's private school tuitions. And they are going to demand their money. Beatrice began to cry openly, burying her face in her hands. My mother, who had spent my entire life protecting Stephanie from the consequences of her vanity, was completely powerless to stop this. "You have exactly 1 week," I told them, picking up my briefcase. "The syndicate's deadline for accelerated payment is next Friday. I highly suggest you stop booking tables at Michelin star restaurants and start figuring out how to liquidate your entire suburban life before those lenders arrive to do it for you." I turned toward the heavy oak doors, leaving them trapped in the nightmare they had so greedily engineered. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and heavy, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. Jamal stared blankly at the polished mahogany table, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. Stephanie was frozen, her hands still resting where they had uselessly slapped the wood, her eyes wide with a terror that finally matched the reality of her situation. But it was Beatrice who broke the silence. My mother, who had spent decades meticulously constructing an illusion of familial perfection, could not handle the raw, unvarnished truth of her golden child's ruin. The narrative she had fiercely protected, the narrative where Stephanie was a success and I was a failure, had just been incinerated. The cognitive dissonance was too much for her to bear. Instead of turning her fury onto the man who had secretly bankrupted her husband and jeopardized her daughter's future, Beatrice chose the path of least resistance. She chose her favorite scapegoat. With a sudden, violent motion, Beatrice launched herself out of her chair. She crossed the short distance between us in 2 rapid steps, her arms swinging in a wide arc. The slap connected with the side of my face with a sharp, stinging crack that echoed through the quiet law office. The sheer force of the blow snapped my head to the side, and a dull, throbbing heat immediately began to bloom across my left cheek. Mr. Donovan gasped, half rising from his seat. "Mrs. Vance, control yourself." He ordered, his voice sharp with professional alarm. "There will be no physical violence in this office." I did not raise a hand to touch my stinging cheek. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not cry. I slowly turned my head back to face my mother, locking my eyes onto hers. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, irrational hatred. The pristine country club matriarch had completely dissolved, replaced by a frantic woman, desperate to maintain her delusions at any cost. "You cold-blooded monster!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice vibrating with a terrifying intensity. "You knew you sat there and let your own sister walk right into a trap. You let her take on $4.5 million in debt, knowing exactly what would happen." "I didn't force her to do anything," I replied, my voice dangerously calm, the adrenaline sharpening my focus. I offered her the truth, and she chose greed. I handed over exactly what she and Jamal demanded. They wanted the mansion. They got the mansion. You should have stopped her. Beatrice screamed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "You should have warned us before you signed that waiver. You are a forensic accountant. You analyze risk for a living. It was your responsibility to protect this family, my responsibility." I laughed, a short, bitter sound that held zero humor. "For 33 years, you have made it abundantly clear that my only responsibility in this family is to serve as the baseline of failure, so Stephanie can look successful by comparison. You just spent the last 20 minutes belittling my career, insulting my lifestyle, and threatening to excommunicate me if I didn't hand over my inheritance. Now suddenly, I am the guardian of the family legacy." Stephanie finally found her voice, a weak, pathetic whimper escaping her lips. "Mom, what are we going to do?" "They are going to take everything. The house, the cars, the kids' school tuitions. We have nothing left." That single terrified sentence from her golden child acted like a cattle prod on Beatrix's warped maternal instincts. She turned back to me, her eyes manic and calculating. The initial shock had passed, and the enabling machinery in her brain was already grinding into motion, desperately seeking a solution that did not involve holding Jamal accountable for his crimes. "You have to fix this, Naomi," Beatrice commanded, stepping closer to me. her voice dropping to a frantic, commanding whisper. "You have to fix this right now. There is no fixing this," I stated flatly. "The debt is legally attached to the title. The acceleration clause has been triggered. The syndicate wants their money." "You have money." Beatrice countered, her eyes narrowing as she mentally calculated my perceived worth. "You have savings. You have a successful career, even if it isn't what your father wanted. You are a certified public accountant with a pristine financial record." I stared at her, the sheer audacity of her statement, rendering me momentarily speechless. "Are you seriously suggesting what I think you are suggesting? I am demanding it?" Beatrice stated, her tone hardening into an absolute ultimatum. "You have no husband. You have no children. You have no significant financial obligations. You are going to use your pristine credit and your CPA license to secure a bridge loan. You are going to co-sign on whatever Jamal needs to consolidate this debt and pay off those horrible people." Mr. Donovan let out a strangled cough of disbelief. "Mrs. Vance, I strongly advise you to stop speaking. What you are suggesting is financial suicide for Naomi, and I will not allow my client to be coerced into such an arrangement. She is my daughter, and she will do as she is told." Beatrice snapped, not even looking at the lawyer. She leaned closer to me, her breath hot against my face. "You owe this to your sister Naomi. Jamal made a mistake. He was trying to provide for his family. He was trying to save his business. He was doing what men do. You cannot sit there in your rented apartment and judge a man with real responsibilities." I looked at Jamal, who was still staring blankly at the floor. He hadn't said a single word in his own defense. He was perfectly content to let my mother fight his battles and demand my financial execution to cover his fraud. "You want me to leverage my entire life, my career, and my personal credit to bail out a man who forged my dying father's signature?" I asked, making sure to articulate every word clearly. "I want you to protect your nieces and nephews," Beatrix screamed, slamming her hand onto the mahogany table. "Do you want 3 innocent children to be thrown out on the street? Do you want them pulled out of their private schools because their aunt was too bitter and jealous to help their father? You are going to fix this. Naomi, you are going to go to the bank today, and you are going to take out whatever loans are necessary to save this family." I looked at my mother, absorbing the absolute toxic depth of her betrayal. She wasn't just willing to sacrifice me. She was demanding it as her maternal right. She believed truly and deeply that my only purpose was to serve as a financial blood bank for Stephanie and Jamal's catastrophic failures. "No," I said quietly. The single syllable hung in the air, heavy and final. "I will not give you a single cent. I will not sign a single document. I will watch this entire facade burn to the ground before I let you drag me into the flames." The finality in my voice triggered something dark and desperate in Jamal. The silent, paralyzed man suddenly snapped back to life, realizing that his usual safety net, my mother's enabling, and my forced compliance had completely vanished. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing with a vicious, cornered intensity. If he couldn't manipulate me into paying his debts, he was going to make sure I went down with him. Jamal stood up slowly from the mahogany table. His frame, which usually projected unearned authority, now radiated a volatile, cornered aggression. He smoothed the lapels of his custom suit with trembling fingers, adjusting his cuffs in a jerky motion. The heavy silence in the law office amplified the sound of his ragged breathing. He stared at me with an expression of pure venom. He had spent years masking his financial incompetence behind a veneer of venture capitalist success, relying on my mother to fund his failures and shield him from consequence. Now that I had exposed his $4 million fraud, he had nothing left to lose. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "What are you doing?" Stephanie asked, her voice hitching with fresh panic as she watched her husband's thumbs fly across the screen. Jamal ignored her. He did not look at Mr. Donovan, who was already reaching for his desk phone to call security. Jamal kept his bloodshot eyes locked directly on mine. He raised the phone to his ear and waited for a moment. Then his entire demeanor shifted in the blink of an eye. The vicious predator vanished instantly, replaced by a frantic son-in-law reporting a catastrophic emergency. "Yes, I need police immediately at the law offices of Donovan and Associates in downtown Boston," Jamal said, his voice cracking with manufactured theatrical distress. "I am reporting a massive case of financial elder abuse and corporate fraud." Beatrice gasped, taking a step back as the reality of what Jamal was doing set in. He was weaponizing the justice system. He continued speaking rapidly into the receiver, pacing the length of the Persian rug. "Yes, the suspect is in the room with us right now. Her name is Naomi. She is a licensed forensic accountant, and she just confessed to manipulating my late father-in-law's estate. She forged loan documents while he was on his deathbed and attached millions of dollars in fraudulent debt to his properties." Jamal paused, listening to the dispatcher, his face twisting into an expression of righteous indignation. "She used her professional credentials to execute a wire fraud scheme, and she is trying to extort us into covering it up." I remained completely motionless watching this desperate performance unfold. It was a vicious, dirty play, but predictable for a man facing federal prison and violent underground creditors. By accusing me first. Jamal was attempting to control the narrative. He wanted to frame the $4.5 million shadow loan not as his own bailout, but as a malicious sabotage orchestrated by a bitter spinster who hated her family. He was throwing my career and freedom into the meat grinder to create a smoke-o'casey screen for his own escape. "Yes, officer." Jamal continued, his voice trembling with fake emotion. "She brought counterfeit bank statements to the estate reading today. She admitted to utilizing her accounting access to bypass banking regulations. My wife and mother-in-law are terrified. She has been threatening us." Stephanie looked from Jamal to me, her eyes widening as the malicious brilliance of her husband's plan dawned on her. If Jamal went down for the mortgage fraud, she lost everything. Her suburban mansion, luxury cars, and social standing would evaporate overnight. But if they could pin this entire disaster on me, if they could convince the authorities that the forensic accountant had manufactured the debt to ruin them, they might walk away clean. I watched the moral compromise happen in real time. Stephanie's posture straightened. She wiped away her genuine tears of terror and replaced them with the expression of a traumatized victim. Beatrice underwent the exact same transformation. My mother, who had just demanded I sacrifice my financial future, now saw a path to protect her golden child by throwing her scapegoat to the wolves. Mr. Donovan finally found his voice. "Mr. Vance, end that call immediately." The lawyer commanded, standing up from his leather chair. "Filing a false police report from my conference room is a severe criminal offense, and I will not permit my office to be used as a staging ground for your perjury. I will testify to exactly what transpired here today." Jamal merely smirked at the lawyer, lowering the phone slightly. "You will testify that you saw documents Naomi brought into this room." Jamal countered, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Documents she curated. Documents she presented. You are just a probate lawyer. Donovan, you have no idea how deep her financial manipulation goes." Jamal brought the phone back to his mouth. "Please hurry," he told the dispatcher, sounding breathless. "We do not feel safe." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, turning to face me with a look of absolute chilling triumph. "You thought you could trap me, Naomi," he sneered, stepping closer until only the width of the mahogany table separated us. "You thought you could walk in here with your little spreadsheets and play the hero, but you forgot how the real world works. The police do not understand complex financial forensics. They understand a grieving family pointing the finger at the cold, a range daughter who works with money for a living." Stephanie moved to stand beside her husband, linking her arm through his. She nodded. her face hardening into a mask of spite. "You have always been jealous of us," she hissed, adopting the narrative Jamal had just established. "You hated Dad for supporting my family. You forged that loan to ruin my inheritance. We are going to tell the detectives everything." Beatrice stepped up to flank Jamal's other side, completing the unholy trinity. "You brought this on yourself." "Naomi," my mother said, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. "We are a united front. It is 3 against 1. Who do you think the police will believe?" The heavy oak doors of the law office swung open with a resounding thud. 2 uniformed police officers stepped over the threshold, their hands resting near their belts. The intrusion shattered the professional atmosphere. The officers scanned the room, their eyes moving from the spilled champagne to the tense standoff around the mahogany table. Jamal did not miss a beat. He stepped forward, raising his hands perfectly, playing the role of a traumatized family man. "Officer, thank God you are here." Jamal breathed out, his voice thick with relief. "I am the one who called. I am Jamal Vance, and this is my wife Stephanie and my mother Beatrice. We are the victims here." He pointed a finger at my chest. "That woman is my sister Naomi. She just confessed to orchestrating a massive financial fraud against our dying father, and she is trying to extort us." Before I could respond, Beatrice launched into a performance. My mother collapsed, burying her face in her hands and letting out a loud sob. She lifted her head to ensure the officers saw her fake tears. "It is true," Beatrice wailed. "She has always hated us. She has always been jealous of her sister's family. She is 33, single, and angry. My poor husband was lying on his deathbed, heavily medicated, and my own daughter used her accounting background to forge his signature on fraudulent loan documents. She wants to ruin us because her father did not leave the mansion to her." Officer Miller, a tall man with a stern expression, frowned and pulled out a notepad. He looked at Beatrice, clearly moved by the desperate display of a widow in mourning. "Ma'am, take a deep breath," the officer said gently. "You are saying your daughter committed financial elder abuse and mortgage fraud." "Yes," Stephanie cried out, joining the chorus. She stepped closer to the officers, twisting her wedding ring nervously. "She just ambushed us with these fake documents. She claims she attached a $4 million debt to my father's estate using an underground syndicate. She told us that if we did not sign away our rights today, she would let criminals destroy our lives. She used her professional credentials as a certified public accountant to bypass banking regulations and manipulate the title. Mr. Donovan slammed his hand onto his desk, his face red with indignation. "Officers, this is an absolute fabrication." The lawyer protested loudly. "I am the executive of this estate. I have been sitting here the entire time. Mr. Vance is the one who brought up the debt." Jamal instantly pivoted, shooting Mr. Donovan. A look of betrayed shock. "Mr. Donovan, please," Jamal pleaded, shaking his head. "You are just a probate lawyer. You do not understand how complex corporate forensics work. Naomi deals with shell companies and hidden assets for a living. She completely pulled the wool over your eyes. She manufactured this entire scenario to frame me because I am a venture capitalist. She knew I would be the perfect fall guy for her crimes. She brought all these fake spreadsheets here today to intimidate us into silence." The second officer, Davis, narrowed his eyes and took a step toward me. The sheer volume and emotional intensity of my family's unified front was incredibly persuasive. 3 distressed, weeping, impeccably dressed suburban citizens pointing the ultimate finger of blame at the cold. Silent woman standing alone with a heavy leather briefcase full of complex financial documents. In the eyes of the law enforcement officers, the optics heavily favored the liars. "Ma'am, step away from the briefcase." Officer Davis commanded his hand, moving to rest on his radio. I did not argue. I calmly took 1 step back, leaving my leather briefcase resting on the mahogany table. I kept my hands perfectly visible at my sides. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice to match their hysterical screaming. I knew that panic was the language of the guilty. Silence and stillness were the weapons of the innocent. Officer Miller joined his partner, stepping directly into my personal space. He pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt, the clinking sound cutting through my mother's fake sobbing. "Do you understand the severity of what these people are accusing you of?" the officer asked, his voice hard and unforgiving. "Financial elder abuse is a severe felony. Forging loan documents on a $4 million estate to defraud your family is a federal crime. If you used your CPA license to facilitate wire fraud and manipulate a probate court, you are not just looking at losing your accounting credentials. You are looking at a decade in a federal penitentiary." Stephanie wiped a tear from her cheek, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "She belongs in jail." "Officer," my sister whispered, playing the victim flawlessly. "She is a cold-blooded monster. We just want to be safe from her. Turn around and place your hands behind your back," Officer Miller ordered, holding the handcuffs up. "We are taking you down to the precinct for questioning regarding these fraud allegations." Jamal let out a slow, shaky breath of relief. He thought he had won. He genuinely thought he was effortlessly walking out of this upscale downtown law office as a completely free man, leaving me to face the immediate wrath of the state justice system and the incredibly violent underground creditors he had foolishly unleashed. I looked at the steel cuffs gleaming under the chandelier. Then I looked directly into Jamal's triumphant, arrogant eyes. I did not turn around. I did not put my hands behind my back. I simply stood my ground, and I gave them a very cold smile. "Officers," I said, my voice cutting through the tension with absolute unwavering authority. "Before you make the severe career-ending mistake of arresting the entirely wrong person today, I highly recommend that you step back and look at the illuminated screen of my personal tablet." Officer Miller hesitated, his grip on the steel handcuffs loosening just a fraction. My absolute lack of panic unsettled him. Police officers are trained to read body language, and the stark contrast between my calm demeanor and my family's hysterical performance was finally registering in his mind. Jamal realized this immediately. He lunged forward, extending his arm to block the tablet resting on the mahogany table. "Officer, do not look at that," Jamal demanded, his voice cracking with a new frantic edge. "She is a forensic accountant. She knows how to doctor digital files and manipulate data. This is a trick." Officer Davis stepped between Jamal and the table, holding up a hand to stop him. "Step back, Mr. Vance," the officer ordered firmly. "Let the lady show us what she has." I tapped the screen of my tablet to wake it up. A year ago. I began to notice irregular withdrawals from my father's secondary accounts. I explained, keeping my eyes locked on the officers. Small, structured amounts designed to evade banking triggers. As a forensic investigator, I do not believe in coincidences. I believe in data. When my father's condition worsened and he became bedridden, I knew whoever was draining his accounts would eventually make a larger, more desperate move. So, as his daughter and a concerned citizen, I took protective measures. I installed discreet high-def in motion, activated nanny cameras in his primary bedroom and his home office. Beatrice let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her face. "You spied on your own father," she shrieked, trying to regain the moral high ground. "You invaded his privacy. I protected him from the predators you welcomed into his home." I snapped back, my voice dripping with ice. I pressed a button on my tablet, casting the display directly to the large smart television mounted on the wall of Mr. Donovan's conference room. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly the room was filled with a crisp, undeniable 4K resolution video. The footage showed my father's bedroom. It was a Tuesday afternoon exactly 6 months ago. The timestamp in the corner of the screen confirmed the exact date and time. My father looked incredibly frail, swallowed by the massive medical bed hooked up to oxygen and an intravenous drip. The room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Then the bedroom door opened. Jamal walked into the frame. The swaggering, arrogant venture capitalist was completely absent. In the video, he looked desperate, sweating and glancing nervously over his shoulder before closing the door firmly behind him. The audio kicked in crystal clear and horrifyingly intimate. We watched as Jamal approached the bed. He did not ask how my father was feeling. He did not offer comfort. He reached into his designer briefcase and pulled out the red folder I had just placed on the conference table minutes ago. "Wake up." "Old man." The digital Jamal hissed on the screen. He aggressively shook my father's frail shoulder. My father groaned, his eyes fluttering open, confused and heavily medicated. He mumbled something unintelligible, clearly disoriented by the morphine. "I need you to sign this right now," Jamal demanded in the video. He shoved the legal document into my father's face. "The syndicate is going to break my legs if I do not give them collateral today. You are dying anyway. You do not need the house." My father tried to push the paper away with a trembling, bruised hand. "No," my father whispered on the recording, his voice incredibly weak. "The house is for the girls. Leave me alone." The Jamal on the television screen snarled. He did not back down. He leaned over the bed, using his physical size to completely trap the dying man. He grabbed my father's right wrist with a violent bruising force. "You are going to sign this, or I swear to God, I will make sure Stephanie cuts the life support funding." Jamal threatened, his voice dropping to a vicious, cruel growl. "I will drain every account you have left and throw your wife out on the street. Sign the paper." We watched in absolute horror as Jamal forcefully wrapped my father's fingers around a pen. He physically guided the frail hand across the signature line, pressing down so hard the paper nearly tore. My father whimpered in pain, his eyes rolling back as the exertion and fear overwhelmed his heavily medicated system. Jamal snatched the paper away the second the jagged signature was complete, leaving my father gasping for air on the pillows. The video ended. The smart television screen went black. The silence in the law office was absolute, thick, and suffocating. The performance my family had just given the police was completely destroyed. There was no spinning this. There was no claiming it was a manipulated spreadsheet or a complex accounting trick. It was high-defin, undeniable proof of a brutal physical and financial assault on a dying man. Officer Miller slowly lowered the steel handcuffs he had been holding. He turned his head and looked directly at Jamal. The officer's expression had hardened into pure, professional disgust. Officer Davis unclipped the radio from his belt, his eyes never leaving Jamal's sweating. Terrified face. Stephanie was shaking violently. She backed away from her husband as if he had suddenly caught fire. She had wanted the mansion, and she had been willing to throw me in prison to get it. But seeing the violent, cowardly reality of how Jamal had secured her inheritance broke her completely. Jamal raised his hands, palms facing outward, backing slowly toward the heavy oak doors. "Officers, you do not understand," he stammered, his voice pitching upward in sheer panic. "That video is out of context. He owed me money. I was just helping him manage his estate. You are done talking." Officer Miller stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stepped forward, intercepting Jamal before he could reach the door handle. I stood my ground next to the mahogany table, looking at the stunned, defeated faces of the people who had just tried to destroy my life. The digital trail was absolute. The visual evidence was irrefutable. My forensic accounting had brought the financial fraud to light, but the hidden camera footage had delivered the lethal blow. I watched as the officers closed in on the man who thought he could outsmart me. The heavy silence in the law office fractured the exact moment Officer Miller took a deliberate step toward Jamal. The visual evidence had completely incinerated the fabricated narrative my family had spent the last hour trying to sell to the authorities. My tablet screen had gone black, but the echo of my father gasping for air seemed to linger in the polished space. I watched as the officers closed in on the man who thought he could outsmart me. Jamal retreated another step, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the hardwood floor just past the Persian rug. He raised both hands in front of his chest, palms facing the approaching officers, wearing a mask of pure panic. "Officers, you have to listen to me," Jamal pleaded, his voice cracking and rising. "That footage is manipulated. She is trying to frame me. I am a legitimate venture capitalist. I have a family. I have a reputation in this city. You cannot just arrest me based on a video she produced. I demand to speak to my attorney right now." Officer Davis unhooked his handcuffs from his belt, the metallic clinking sound ringing out sharp and clear. "Sir, you need to turn around and place your hands behind your back," Officer Davis commanded. His tone was devoid of the polite patience he had shown earlier. "You are being detained on suspicion of elder abuse and fraud. Turn around now." Stephanie pressed her back against the far wall, her hands clamped tightly over her mouth. She watched her powerful husband, the man whose wealth and status she had constantly weaponized against me, unravel completely. Beatrice stood frozen near the shattered remains of the champagne glass, her eyes darting frantically between the police and the door, searching for a non-existent escape hatch from this nightmare. "I am not going anywhere with you," Jamal barked, his panic rapidly morphing into a cornered, volatile rage. "Do you know who I am? Do you know who my friends are? You are making a massive mistake. I will have your badges for this. I will sue this entire department." Officer Miller closed the distance in 2 rapid strides. "Mr. Advance, this is your final warning," the officer stated, reaching out to grasp Jamal by the shoulder. "Comply immediately or you will face additional charges for resisting arrest." The moment the officer's hand made contact with his custom-tailored suit jacket, Jamal snapped. The illusion of the sophisticated businessman evaporated, revealing the desperate, violent fraudster beneath. With a sudden explosive burst of adrenaline, Jamal violently shoved Officer Miller backward. The sudden movement caught the officer off guard, sending him stumbling against a heavy leather armchair. Jamal lunged toward the heavy oak doors, choosing flight over compliance. He was desperate to escape the trap he had built for himself. He did not make it far. Officer Davis reacted with lightning speed. He lunged forward, grabbing a handful of Jamal's expensive suit jacket. Jamal twisted fiercely, trying to break free, throwing a wild, uncoordinated elbow backward. The blow glanced off the officer's shoulder, escalating the confrontation from a standard detention into an active physical altercation inside an upscale probate law office. "Stop resisting," Officer Davis shouted, wrapping his arms securely around Jamal's torso. Officer Miller recovered his balance instantly and charged back into the fray. Together, the 2 officers overpowered the flailing, desperate man. They grabbed Jamal by his arms and used his forward momentum against him. Pivoting sharply, Jamal was lifted entirely off his feet, with a tremendous bone-rattling crash. The officers slammed Jamal face first onto the center of Mr. Donovan's massive mahogany conference table. The impact shook the entire room. The remaining intact champagne flute toppled over, rolling off the edge and shattering on the floor. Jamal's cheek against the polished wood where the inheritance waiver had sat just moments before. He grunted in pain. His breath knocked completely out of his lungs. His legs kicked wildly against the side of the table, scuffing the expensive wood with his leather shoes. But the officers held him down with absolute, unyielding force. "Get your hands behind your back," Officer Miller barked, pressing his knee firmly between Jamal's shoulder blades to pin him to the table. "Quit fighting or it is going to get worse for you." Stephanie let out a piercing, hysterical scream. "Jamal!" she wailed, taking a futile step forward before stopping herself, too terrified of the police to intervene. Beatrice covered her eyes, unable to watch the violent destruction of her golden son-in-law. Mr. Donovan stood safely behind his desk, his face pale, watching the scene unfold with professional horror. I stood perfectly still, my posture completely relaxed. I watched the scene with cold, analytical detachment. Jamal had tried to orchestrate my imprisonment. He had tried to steal my freedom to cover his catastrophic financial failures. Seeing him pinned to the table, completely stripped of his arrogant power, was not a moment of joy. It was simply the mathematical equation of justice balancing itself out. Jamal gasped for air, his cheek pressed flat against a puddle of spilled champagne. He finally stopped struggling, his body going limp under the weight of the officers. The fight had completely drained out of him. Officer Davis forcibly pulled Jamal's arms behind his back. The sharp mechanical ratcheting sound of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around Jamal's wrists echoed loudly in the room. It was the sound of absolute finality. Jamal Vance. Officer Miller declared, his voice cutting through the chaotic aftermath of the scuffle. "You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent," Officer Davis recited, pulling Jamal upright. "Anything you say can and will be used against you. You have the right to an attorney. You are under arrest for felony mortgage fraud, bank fraud, and elder abuse." Jamal looked utterly pathetic, his custom suit torn and soaked in champagne. A broken fraud, finally facing the devastating consequences of his own absolute greed. Officer Miller and Officer Davis hauled Jamal toward the heavy oak doors. His custom-tailored suit hung awkwardly on his frame. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, the metallic clinking of the handcuffs echoing. The officers pushed him through the doorway, marching the broken venture capitalist toward a federal holding cell. The door swung shut, sealing the three of us inside the wreckage of Mr. Donovan's conference room. The silence that settled over the mahogany table was the hollow quiet of a total catastrophe. I remained standing by my leather briefcase, watching the scene unfold with absolute detachment. My forensic accounting had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had ripped away the facade and exposed the rot beneath. Stephanie stood frozen by the shattered remains of her crystal champagne flute. Her chest heaved with shallow breaths. She stared at the closed oak doors, processing the rapid disintegration of her perfectly curated suburban life. In 20 minutes, her powerful husband had been exposed as a predatory fraud, arrested for elder abuse, and hauled away. More terrifyingly, the $4 million Beacon Hill mansion she coveted was now a lethal financial anchor. It was tied to a massive debt to a violent underground syndicate that would undoubtedly foreclose on her within the week. She had absolutely nothing left. Beatrice let out a low wail. The illusion she had fiercely protected had evaporated. Her golden son-in-law was a criminal. Her favorite daughter was facing total financial ruin. I expected Stephanie to collapse, to fall to her knees and weep. But Stephanie was a survivor in the most parasitic sense. The shock began to wear off, and I watched the sheer, calculating greed return to her eyes. She violently wiped away the few genuine tears that had escaped her mascara. The weeping, traumatized wife vanished instantly, replaced by a cornered opportunist, looking for her next lifeline. She turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto me. The malice in her expression was palpable. She took a step toward my side of the table, her expensive designer heels crunching over the broken glass scattered across the Persian rug. She did not care about the gravity of the federal crimes Jamal had just been charged with. She only cared about her own survival. "Naomi," Stephanie said, her voice dropping into a hard, demanding register. "We need to talk about the remaining assets right now." Mr. Donovan held up a trembling hand. "Mrs. Vance, I strongly advise against any further negotiations today. You need to contact a criminal defense attorney immediately." "Shut up." "Donovan," Stephanie snapped, not glancing at the lawyer. Jamal is going to need the best defense team in the state to fight these ridiculous charges. Do you have any idea how much a federal criminal trial costs? It will be hundreds of thousands of dollars just to secure a retainer. Thanks to your stunt with the police, our accounts are going to be frozen. The syndicate is going to take the mansion. I have absolutely no liquidity left. Beatrice moved to stand right behind Stephanie. The enabling mother had found her new mission. Listen to your sister Naomi, Beatrice commanded. Jamal made a terrible mistake, but he is still family. You cannot let him rot in a prison cell while his children suffer the public humiliation of a trial. You have to help us fix this immediately. I looked at them, genuinely marveling at the boundless depth of their entitlement. They had just tried to frame me for felony mortgage fraud to save their own skins. Now, less than 5 minutes after the police had dragged the actual criminal away, they were demanding I fund his legal defense. And how exactly do you propose I fix this? I asked, my voice perfectly level. You demanded the house. You signed the paperwork. You own the debt. What remaining assets are you possibly talking about? Stephanie slammed her hand flat against the mahogany table. Do not play dumb with me. Naomi, we are going to redivide the estate right now. She pointed directly at my leather briefcase. You are going to surrender the Rural Limited Liability Company and the barren land outside the city limits. You are going to sign the deed over to my name today. It is the only unencumbered asset left in Dad's portfolio. It might just be an empty plot of dirt, but it has acreage. I can sell it to a commercial developer for a few $100,000. It will pay for Jamal's legal retainers and keep my family afloat. I stared at her, letting the sheer audacity of her demand hang in the quiet room. She wanted the dirt. The same dirt she had mocked and belittled less than an hour ago. She had laughed at the idea of me owning it, insisting it suited my pathetic single lifestyle, now that her glittering prize had turned into a financial death sentence. She wanted to snatch back the consolation prize she had so generously allowed me to keep. You want the Rural LLC, I stated, making sure I heard her correctly. You want the barren land. Yes, Stephanie demanded, her voice shrill and completely entitled. I am taking the $4.5 million debt. It is only fair that I get the remaining liquid assets to balance the scale. You set us up. Naomi, you knew the house was a trap and you let us take it. You owe me this land. Tell Donovan to draft the transfer deed right now. Beatrice crossed her arms over her chest. It is the only logical solution. Naomi, you have your own job. You have your own savings. You do not need that empty plot of land. Your sister is facing destitution. Hand over the property deed so she can sell it and hire a lawyer for Jamal. If you refuse to do this, you are deliberately choosing to destroy this family. I stared at my mother, letting the echo of her accusation fade into the polished mahogany walls of the conference room. She stood there with her chin raised, completely oblivious to the staggering hypocrisy of her own words. In her warped reality, Jamal forging documents and stealing millions was just a simple mistake. But my refusal to surrender my inheritance to fund his defense was a deliberate betrayal. Beatrice's rigid posture began to crumble as my silence stretched on. The realization that her commanding tone was no longer effective finally pierced through her delusion. The fierce matriarch melted away, replaced by a desperate, pleading woman who was terrified of losing her social standing. She took a step toward me, her hands clasped tightly in front of her chest, her eyes brimming with a new wave of manufactured tears. Naomi, please, Beatrice begged, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. You have to understand what is at stake here. It is not just about Jamal. It is about our name. It is about the public humiliation this will bring down upon us. How am I supposed to show my face at the country club tomorrow? How am I supposed to sit at charity board meetings knowing everyone is whispering about my son-in-law being dragged away in handcuffs? She reached out, attempting to grasp my arm. But I stepped back smoothly, maintaining an ironclad physical boundary. Beatrice dropped her hands, her face twisting in a fleeting moment of annoyance before she forced the pleading mask into place. "We will be ruined," Beatrice continued, her voice trembling. "The scandal will destroy everything your father and I worked so hard to build. The suburban community is vicious, Naomi. They will tear Stephanie apart. Her children will be ostracized at their private school. We need to hire the best crisis management firm and criminal defense attorneys. That requires immediate liquidity. You have to give us that land. It is the only way to save us from total financial annihilation." I looked from my pleading mother to my sister. Stephanie had stopped crying entirely. The initial shock of Jamal's violent arrest had worn off, and her default defense mechanism had kicked in, even while staring down the barrel of massive debt. Stephanie could not resist the urge to belittle me. She crossed her arms, her posture shifting back to the arrogant, condescending, golden child I had known my entire life. "Listen to Mom." "Naomi." Stephanie scoffed, a harsh, mocking laugh escaping her lips. She tossed her highlighted hair over her shoulder, attempting to project a confidence she did not possess. "Do not act like you are giving up some grand prize. We are talking about a worthless rural limited liability company. It is a barren dust bowl outside the city limits. There is nothing out there but rocks and dead grass. You are fighting to keep a glorified dirt patch." Stephanie took a step forward, her tone dripping with venom and false superiority. "Let us be incredibly realistic here," she sneered, looking me up and down as if analyzing a poor investment. "You are a single woman living in a rented apartment. Do you have any idea what the annual property taxes are on an undeveloped commercial plot of that size? The municipal assessments alone will bankrupt you within 3 years. You cannot afford the upkeep. You cannot even afford to put a fence around it." She gestured wildly toward my leather briefcase. "You keeping that land is a complete financial joke," Stephanie continued, her voice growing louder and more aggressive. "It is a dead asset generating zero revenue. If you walk out of here with that deed, you are going to drown in property taxes just to spite me. You will ruin your credit score over a patch of useless dirt. Hand it over. I have commercial developer contacts who buy distressed properties for pennies on the dollar. I can liquidate it by next week. It will keep my husband out of federal prison, which is infinitely more important than your petty need to hold on to a meaningless piece of paper." Stephanie did not wait for my response. She spun around and slammed her hand flat on Mr. Donovan's desk. The lawyer jumped, startled by her sudden aggressive movement. "Donovan, draft the transfer of deed right now!" Stephanie commanded, her voice ringing with the absolute entitlement of a woman who believed she still held all the cards. "Draw up the paperwork to transfer the Rural Limited Liability Company entirely into my name. Naomi is surrendering the asset. We will sign it right here, right now, before I leave this office to bail my husband out of jail. Do it, mister." Donovan looked at Stephanie, then shifted his gaze to me. His professional demeanor was strained to the breaking point. He was an experienced probate attorney, but he had never witnessed a family implode with such spectacular, vicious speed. He picked up his silver pen, holding it above a fresh pad, clearly waiting for my authorization before making a single move. I remained perfectly still. I let the silence hang in the air, allowing Stephanie and Beatrix to absorb the echo of their own desperate, manipulative demands. They had spent the entire morning treating me like an ignorant pawn. They had mocked my career, insulted my lifestyle, and tried to frame me for federal crimes. Now they were demanding my property, convinced I was too naive to understand its value. They believed the land was just a barren dust bowl. They believed my father had kept it out of sentimentality. They believed Jamal was the only person who understood corporate finance. I looked at my sister, whose face was flushed with frantic, demanding rage, and my mother, who was practically vibrating with toxic anxiety. I took a slow, deep breath, preparing to permanently shatter the very last illusion they had left in this world and reveal the absolute truth about my father's estate. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality across the table. "Mr. Donovan will not be drafting a transfer of deed today, tomorrow, or ever." Stephanie's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. She opened her mouth to scream, to launch into another tirade about her husband's impending prison sentence and imminent social ruin. But I held up a single finger, cutting her off instantly. I did not look at her. Instead, I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out my sleek silver laptop. Beatrice let out a frustrated gasp. "Naomi, this is not the time to look at your spreadsheets. Your sister's life is falling apart." I ignored my mother completely. I walked over to the large smart television mounted on the wall of Mr. Donovan's conference room, the same screen I had used to broadcast Jamal's violent coercion of my dying father. I plugged a small cable into the side of the display, syncing my laptop to the screen. The monitor flickered to life, bathing the dim room in a cool blue light. You and Jamal spent this entire morning mocking my career. I began keeping my back to them as I typed a secure password into my keyboard. You called me a glorified bookkeeper. You claimed I had no understanding of real-world finance, capital expansion, or corporate leverage. You were so convinced your superficial country club networking made you financial titans that you never bothered to investigate the assets you were fighting over. I pressed a button and a highly detailed multi-layered topographical map appeared on the massive screen. It was not a standard property survey. It was a complex geological schematic crisscrossed with vibrant blue thermal imaging lines, red boundary markers, and dense environmental data. The specific plot of land owned by the Rural Limited Liability Company was outlined in a thick, undeniable neon green border right in the center of the display. Stephanie crossed her arms, glaring at the screen with disdain. "What is this supposed to be?" she demanded, her voice dripping with venom. "A map of your precious dirt. Do you think showing us a colorful picture of a barren field is going to change the fact that my husband is in federal custody?" "It is a geological and hydrological survey," I explained calmly, turning to face my family. "And it proves exactly why you and your husband are completely financially illiterate. You looked at the surface of that rural property and saw nothing but dead grass and rocks. You assumed because it was not located in a wealthy suburban zip code, it held absolutely no value. You judged a corporate asset with the exact same superficial vanity you used to judge everything else in your life." I picked up a laser pointer from Mr. Donovan's desk and directed the red dot to the center of the neon green boundary on the screen. "The value of this land is not on the surface," I stated, tracing the massive, sprawling blue thermal patterns that flowed directly underneath the property lines. "The value is located exactly 400 feet underground. You see these blue indicators. This Rural Limited Liability Company sits directly on top of a massive high-volume, naturally replenishing underground aquifer. It is one of the largest and most pristine subterranean water sources in the entire state." Beatrice frowned, her perfectly plucked eyebrows drawing together in genuine confusion. "An aquifer?" my mother asked, her voice losing some of its aggressive edge. "You mean well, Naomi, we are facing bankruptcy and federal indictments. Why are you wasting our time talking about groundwater? Are you planning to sell bottled water to pay for Jamal's legal defense?" I let out a soft, humorless laugh. They were so tragically behind the curve of modern economics. "I am talking about the modern tech boom. I educated them," my voice projecting the absolute authority of a top-tier forensic auditor. "I am talking about the actual driving force behind the global economy. Right now, the largest technology conglomerates are racing to build massive data centers. They are constructing colossal facilities to house the servers that power artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and global digital infrastructure. These facilities are the size of small cities, and they house tens of thousands of processors working simultaneously. I clicked a button on my laptop, bringing up a secondary slide showing a massive industrial data center. Do you have any idea how much heat tens of thousands of artificial intelligence servers generate? I asked, looking directly at Stephanie. They generate enough heat to melt their own internal components within hours. Traditional air conditioning cannot keep up with that level of thermal output. The only way to keep a massive modern data center operational is through aggressive high-volume liquid cooling systems. They need millions of gallons of cold water circulating continuously through the facility every single day to prevent catastrophic system failures. Tech companies cannot just build these data centers anywhere. I continued relentlessly. If they tap into a municipal water supply, they will drain a city dry in a month. They cannot use ocean water without incredibly expensive desalination processes. They desperately need to find massive, privately owned, unencumbered natural water sources. They need cold aquifers. I pointed the laser back at the vibrant blue mass on the geological map. This exact aquifer, I stated, tapping the laser pointer against the screen for emphasis. The one sitting directly underneath the barren dust bowl you just practically begged me to keep. It is the holy grail of modern commercial real estate. Stephanie, it is the most highly sought after, strategically critical piece of undeveloped commercial real estate in this entire region. Stephanie blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing as her brain desperately tried to reject the reality unfolding on the high-definition screen. She shook her head, a harsh, dismissive sound escaping her throat. "You are making this up," she insisted, her voice shrill and trembling with denial. "This is just a theory. You found a map online, and you are spinning a ridiculous fantasy to make yourself feel important. Tech companies do not buy farmland from dead men." I lowered the laser pointer and walked back to the conference table, closing the distance between us. It is not a fantasy. "Stephanie," I said, my tone dropping to a deadly quiet register. "And they did not buy it from a dead man. They bought it from a visionary. Our father knew exactly what he possessed." Beatrice gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. "Your father knew about this water?" my mother asked, her eyes darting between me and the glowing geological map. But he never said a word to Jamal. He never mentioned a commercial tech deal at family dinners. "Of course, he did not mention it to Jamal," I countered, staring directly into my mother's horrified eyes. "Dad was sick, but he was never stupid. He saw right through your golden son-in-law from day one. He knew Jamal was a hollow, arrogant parasite who was drowning in debt and desperate for a bailout. Dad knew that if he breathed a single word about a multi-million-dollar corporate land acquisition, Jamal would have swooped in, manipulated the documents, and stolen the capital to feed his own fraudulent lifestyle, just like he eventually did with the mansion." I turned my attention back to the laptop, pulling up a new folder. So, 2 years ago, when the initial exploratory surveys came back positive, Dad did not go to his flashy venture capitalist son-in-law for help. He came to me. Stephanie flinched as if she had been physically struck. Her entire worldview built on the absolute certainty that I was the family disappointment was shattering into jagged pieces. He came to the forensic accountant. I continued letting the weight of my profession hang in the air. He needed someone who understood complex corporate structuring, someone who could navigate ironclad non-disclosure agreements, and someone who knew how to hide massive financial movements in plain sight. He needed absolute secrecy, and he trusted me to execute it. For the past 24 months, while you two were busy posting pictures of your country club brunches and criticizing my modest apartment, I was working 2 full-time jobs. By day, I was running my standard forensic audits. By night, I was acting as the sole financial representative for our father's rural limited liability company. I tapped the keyboard, bringing up a dizzying array of legal filings, environmental impact studies, and municipal zoning permits on the large screen. It was a brutal, grueling process, I explained, gesturing to the dense paperwork. I sat through endless, highly classified meetings with commercial developers. I negotiated water rights with state regulators. I secured the required industrial zoning variances. And I did it all under the completely boring generic name of the Rural LLC. We intentionally kept the paperwork as mundane as possible. Beatrice gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles white. "Who are you negotiating with?" she demanded, her voice barely a whisper. "What company wants to build out there?" I did not smile, but the profound satisfaction of the moment radiated through my entire body. We were not dealing with a local developer, I stated clearly. We bypassed the middleman entirely. I negotiated directly with the corporate acquisitions division of Amazon. The name dropped like an anvil in the quiet law office. Amazon, one of the wealthiest, most powerful tech conglomerates on the planet. They designated this specific plot as the primary site for their next-generation Amazon Web Services artificial intelligence data center. I revealed, watching my sister's eyes widen in absolute, unadulterated horror. They needed the aquifer, and we held the exclusive deed. They offered a premium, expedited buyout to lock out their competitors. I looked at Mr. Donovan, who was staring at the screen with an expression of profound professional awe. The lawyer had processed the basic estate transfer completely unaware of the corporate leviathan lurking behind the simple Rural LLC designation. "You see, Stephanie," I said, turning back to my sister. This is where Jamal's catastrophic arrogance sealed his own fate. He was so incredibly obsessed with image. He wanted the Beacon Hill mansion because it was a trophy. It was a tangible, flashy asset he could brag about at his networking events. He needed a recognizable luxury property to prove to his shadow lenders that he was still a heavy hitter. I walked around the mahogany table, stopping just a few feet away from her. When Jamal looked at the estate portfolio, he saw a $4 million historic house, and he saw a Rural LLC with a registered address in the middle of nowhere. Because he possesses zero actual financial intelligence. He never bothered to open the corporate ledger. He never requested a geological survey. He looked at the word rural and dismissed it immediately. His ego completely blinded him to the gold mine sitting right in front of his face. "He pushed the dirt onto me because he thought it was a punishment," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. He thought he was leaving the family failure with a useless, tax-draining burden. He was so desperate to secure the mansion that he forcefully isolated me to the one asset he deemed worthless. Beatrice let out a long, ragged exhale, the devastating reality of the situation, finally overriding her denial. "You hid an Amazon data center deal from your own family," she accused, her voice shaking with a potent mix of grief and fury. "You sat there and let us treat you like a failure while you were managing a corporate buyout. I did not hide anything." "Mother," I countered sharply, "you simply never asked. You were too busy evaluating my worth based on my marital status to ask about my career. You were too busy worshiping Jamal's fake venture capital firm to realize your own daughter was closing the largest commercial real estate transaction in the county." I walked back to my laptop and rested my hand on the smooth silver casing. I did the grueling invisible work for 2 solid years. I secured the zoning, I finalized the environmental clearances, and I structured the final transfer of ownership. And because Jamal was so ruthlessly focused on stealing the mansion, he made sure I was the only person left standing when the final contract was signed. Stephanie's breathing became shallow and rapid. "The contract," she gasped, her eyes darting frantically around the room. "You said they offered a premium buyout. Naomi, how much is the contract worth? What did Amazon pay for the land?" I looked at my sister, taking in her ruined designer dress, her tear-stained face, and the absolute crushing desperation in her eyes. It was time to deliver the final fatal number. "You want to know the exact figure." "Stephanie, I asked, my tone utterly devoid of sympathy. You want to know the exact price of the asset you just aggressively forced me to keep? I pressed the final button on my keyboard. The geological map on the smart television instantly vanished, replaced by a single high-resolution scan of a fully executed corporate wire transfer confirmation. The logo of Amazon Web Services sat prominently at the top of the banking document. The room held its collective breath as their eyes locked onto the bold, black numbers printed across the center of the illuminated screen. The final closing amount secured and processed just hours before this very meeting. $32 million, I read aloud, making sure every single syllable hit the air with absolute unapologetic clarity. The bold black numbers on the smart television screen seemed to burn themselves into the retinas of everyone in the room. 3, 2, followed by 6 zeros. A pristine, perfectly executed wire transfer receipt directly from Amazon Web Services. Stephanie stopped breathing. Her eyes bulged as they darted back and forth across the screen, desperately searching for a decimal point. A typo. A clerical error. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords refused to produce a sound. The staggering magnitude of the number, completely short, circuited her brain. She had spent her entire adult life defining wealth by leased luxury cars and country club memberships. $32 million in clean, liquid corporate cash was a concept she could not even begin to process. Beatrice gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles turned a stark, bruised white. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to lose its bounce and her posture collapsed. 32 million. My mother whispered the words, scraping against her throat like sandpaper. Naomi, that is impossible. That is a corporate buyout. You are just a single accountant. You cannot possibly manage a transaction of that size. I stepped away from the screen and walked back to my leather briefcase. I can, and I did. I corrected her, my voice radiating cold authority. The deal officially closed at 8 o'clock this morning, while you were busy preparing your vicious little speeches to insult my lifestyle. I was on a secure conference call with Seattle. The funds have already cleared. They are currently sitting in a heavily encrypted escrow account tied exclusively to the Rural Limited Liability Company, the exact same company you just spent the last hour mocking. Stephanie finally found her breath sucking in air with a loud, desperate gasp. She lunged forward, her hands slapping against the polished wood of the table. "But that is Dad's company," Stephanie shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "That means it is family money. It belongs to the estate. We get half. Jamal needs that money for his lawyers. You have to transfer our half right now." I looked at my sister, genuinely marveling at her staggering lack of self-awareness. I did not raise my voice. I simply let the absolute reality of her own actions crush her. "Did you forget what happened 10 minutes ago, Stephanie?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Did you forget the legal document you forced me to sign, the waiver you aggressively shoved in my face? You and Jamal were so terrified of splitting the Beacon Hill mansion that you demanded a total separation of assets. You wanted the house all to yourselves. To do that, you forced me to sign a legally binding disclaimer of interest." I turned to the estate lawyer who was watching the scene with a mix of professional shock and sheer awe. "Mr. Donovan," I said, keeping my gaze locked on my sister. "Could you please clarify the exact legal parameters of the waiver Stephanie just celebrated?" Mr. Donovan adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling slightly as he looked at his legal pad. "The waiver is absolute and irrevocable," the lawyer stated, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "By executing the document through the state registry portal, Naomi formally surrendered all claims to the primary residential estate. In return, the remaining secondary asset, which is the Rural Limited Liability Company, became her sole and exclusive inheritance." The lawyer paused, looking directly at Stephanie. "It means she owns the company 100%. You isolated her to that specific asset. Therefore, Naomi is the sole, exclusive, and unchallengeable legal beneficiary of the $32 million payout." You have absolutely no claim to a single cent of it. Mrs. Vance. Stephanie staggered backward as if she had been physically struck in the chest. Her designer heels caught on the edge of the Persian rug, and she fell hard into her leather chair. She stared at me, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. She had built her entire identity on being the superior wealthy sister. Now she was staring at the woman she had relentlessly bullied, realizing that I was now richer than she could have ever dreamed of becoming. "You did this on purpose," Beatrice wailed, pointing a trembling finger at me. Her maternal facade was entirely gone, replaced by the vicious, venomous entitlement she had always harbored. "You knew that land was worth millions. You sat there and let Jamal take the house with the debt. You manipulated us into giving you the fortune. You stole from your own family." "I did not steal anything," I replied, my tone dropping to a deadly quiet register. "I brought my father's legal paperwork to this office today, fully prepared to divide everything equally. I was fully prepared to sit down, run a forensic audit of the entire estate, expose Jamal's fraud, and protect this family from the syndicate. I came here to do my job." I took a step closer to my mother, closing the distance until I could see the terrified reflection of myself in her eyes. "But you did not want my protection," I stated, enunciating every word with razor-sharp precision. "You wanted to humiliate me. You wanted to appease Jamal's massive ego. You told me my career was a joke. You told me my life was a failure. You demanded I take the worthless dirt and leave the real assets to the adults." I swept my hand toward the glowing smart television screen showcasing the $32 million wire transfer. "So I did exactly what you commanded, Mother. I took the dirt. I let you keep the mansion. I let you keep the $4.5 million shadow loan. You wanted to make the financial decisions for this family, and now you have to live with the catastrophic consequences of your blinding greed." Stephanie began to hyperventilate. Her hands clawed at her own hair, ruining her perfect, expensive salon blowout. The walls of her reality were violently collapsing. Her husband was currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser facing federal wire fraud charges and a decade in prison. Her beloved suburban mansion was a toxic asset guaranteed to be seized by violent underground creditors by next Friday. Her children's private school tuitions, her country club memberships, her luxury cars. All of it was gone. And sitting right across the table from her, completely insulated from the financial apocalypse she had triggered, was her younger sister. The sister she had mocked. The sister she had called a spinster. The sister who was now holding a clean, legally untouchable $32 million corporate payout. "Please," Stephanie choked out her voice, reduced to a pathetic, ragged whisper. The arrogance was completely eradicated. She was begging. "Naomi, please, you cannot do this. You have $32 million. You have more money than you could ever spend. You have to give us some of it. Jamal is going to prison. The syndicate is going to take my house. You have to save us." Beatrice fell to her knees right there on the Persian rug. The proud, toxic matriarch physically collapsed under the weight of her own ruin. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Her hands clasped together in desperate supplication. She was ready to gravel, ready to say anything to access the fortune I now controlled. I looked down at the two women who had made my life a living hell. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been permanently and violently rewritten. They were utterly broken, trapped in a financial prison of their own making. Staring up at the $32 million key they had just willingly thrown away. The silence in the room stretched until it became unbearable. Stephanie stared at the illuminated numbers on the screen, her chest heaving as if she were suffocating under the weight of her own monumental mistake. The arrogance that had defined her entire existence was completely gone. She looked at her manicured hands, then at the shattered champagne glass on the Persian rug, and finally at me. Her knees simply gave out. The golden child of the family. The woman who had spent 33 years looking down her nose at my apartment. My career. And my life crumpled onto the floor of the law office. She did not kneel with any sort of dignity or grace. She collapsed into a pathetic sobbing heap, the expensive fabric of her designer dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. Beatrice was already on the floor, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table as she tried to comprehend the absolute magnitude of her ruin. The pristine matriarch, who had violently slapped my face less than an hour ago, was now crawling toward me. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her expensive makeup ran in dark, ugly streaks down her pale cheeks. She reached out with trembling fingers, desperately attempting to grab the hem of my tailored blazer. I took a deliberate step backward, ensuring she grasped nothing but empty air. Naomi. Please, Stephanie wailed, her voice cracking into a hysterical, high-pitched screech that hurt my ears. You have to help me. You have $32 million. You have more money than anyone could ever possibly spend in a lifetime. Just give me $5 million. Give me $4 million. Just enough to clear the syndicate debt and keep the mansion. I have 3 children. Naomi. Your nieces and nephews are going to be thrown out on the street. They will lose their private schools, their friends, everything they know. You cannot let innocent children suffer because Jamal made a mistake. I looked down at my sister, watching her weaponize her own children to shield herself from the devastating consequences of her blinding greed. Jamal did not make a mistake. I stated, my voice echoing with a chilling absolute calm that pierced right through her loud sobbing. He committed multiple federal felonies. He forged highly sensitive legal documents. He brutally assaulted our dying father. And you cheered him on. You demanded I surrender my inheritance to fund his fake venture capital empire. Your children are not losing their home because of me. They are losing their home because their parents are arrogant, predatory frauds. Beatrice let out a loud, agonizing sob, pressing her forehead against the hard floorboards before looking back up at me with wild, frantic eyes. Naomi, listen to your heart. My mother pleaded, her voice thick with manufactured desperation and terror. We are your family. Blood is thicker than water. We have had our extreme disagreements. Yes, but at the end of the day, we only have each other. You cannot walk away from your own flesh and blood when we are facing total, inescapable financial destruction. I am your mother. I gave you life. You owe us your absolute loyalty. My gaze locked onto the woman who had allowed my brother-in-law to humiliate me, who had actively participated in a conspiracy to frame me for elder abuse, and who had physically struck me when her golden son-in-law was rightfully exposed. You want to talk about blood? Mother, I asked, the sheer audacity of her statement fueling the icy fire burning deep in my chest. Where was your loyalty to your blood when you slapped me across the face? Where was your loyalty when you lied to the police officers fully prepared to send your own daughter to a federal prison to protect Jamal? You were perfectly willing to let me rot in a concrete cell for 10 years so Stephanie could keep her precious country club membership. Stephanie grabbed the wooden leg of my chair, pulling herself up slightly from the Persian rug. I will do anything. Naomi. My sister choked out her face, a complete mask of ruined vanity. I will sign whatever legal contracts you want. I will publicly apologize to you. I will get on my knees in front of the entire extended family and admit I was wrong. Just write a check right now. It is absolutely nothing to you now. A few $1 million is just pocket change for you. Please, I am begging you. Do not let those violent criminals take my entire life away. I did not flinch. I did not soften. The basic human empathy they were so desperately trying to extract from me had been systematically murdered by decades of their endless emotional abuse. You are right about one thing. Stephanie, I replied, staring down at her tear-streaked, pathetic face. A few million is pocket change to me now, but I would rather set that money on fire and watch it burn than give a single cent of it to people who view me as disposable. You both made your final choices today. You chose to value social status over personal integrity. You chose to value a criminal over your own sister and daughter. I turned slightly to look at Mr. Donovan. The seasoned estate lawyer was sitting completely still behind his desk, watching the chaotic scene with wide, shocked eyes. The extreme level of graveling happening on his expensive Persian rug was unprecedented in his long, storied legal career. Mr. Donovan, I said smoothly, could you please verbally confirm the current status of the estate liabilities for my mother and sister? The lawyer swallowed hard nervously, adjusting his glasses before looking directly at my sister. As of today, he stated firmly, Mrs. Vance is exclusively responsible for the massive hidden debt attached to the property. Naomi holds absolutely no legal or financial obligation to assist you with catastrophic debt today. The lawyer's words hung in the heavy air of the conference room. Absolute and final. I looked down at the two women graveling on the expensive Persian rug. The icy detachment spreading through my veins was a profound, liberating sensation. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the familiar, crushing weight of familial obligation that had suffocated me for 33 entire years. I only felt the cold, hard clarity of a woman who had just successfully amputated a severely gangrenous limb. The emotional blackmail they had relied on for decades had completely lost its power over me. Get up, Beatrice, I commanded, my voice slicing through her pathetic theatrical sobbing with surgical precision. Stop crawling on the floor like a wounded animal. It is incredibly embarrassing to watch, and it will not change a single thing about your current reality. My mother stopped reaching for my shoes, but she did not stand. She remained on her knees. Her tear-streaked face tilted upward in an expression of desperate disbelief. You cannot do this to your own mother, she wept, her voice trembling with a lifetime of toxic entitlement. You owe me. Naomi, I brought you into this world. I raised you. You brought me into this world. And then you spent 3 decades trying to make me feel completely worthless, I replied, stepping around her to retrieve my leather briefcase from the mahogany table. Do not dare invoke the sanctity of motherhood, now that you are looking straight down the barrel of total financial ruin. You love to loudly proclaim that blood is thicker than water, but you use blood as an excuse to be a relentless parasite. You use the concept of family as a weapon to demand absolute compliance, unquestioning financial sacrifice, and total submission to your warped narcissistic narrative. I snapped the brass latches of my briefcase shut, the sharp clicking sound making my mother flinch violently. You sat right there and watched Jamal physically assault my dying father on high-defin video, and your very first instinct was to slap my face for exposing his crimes. You lied to the police officers fully prepared to send your own daughter to a federal penitentiary for 10 years just to protect a man who was actively bankrupting your estate. You are a parasite mother. You fed on my father's hard work. You fed on Jamal's fake prestigious lifestyle. And now you eagerly want to attach yourself to my $32 million contract. I am establishing an iron boundary right here, right now. You will never see a single cent of my money. You will not see a dime for your housing, not a penny for your exclusive country club dues, and absolutely nothing to maintain your pathetic suburban facade. Beatrice let out a strangled, agonizing wail, burying her face in her manicured hands as the devastating reality of her permanent excommunication finally took hold. I turned my cold gaze to Stephanie. My older sister was still huddled by the leg of my heavy leather chair, her designer dress completely ruined by spilled champagne and dust, her hands shaking violently. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for a miraculous reprieve that was never going to come. And you, Stephanie, I said, dropping my voice to a lethal, quiet register that forced her to listen to every single word. You enthusiastically dug your own grave today. You grabbed a shovel and you gleefully dug a 4.5 million hole because your toxic vanity demanded it. You were so incredibly desperate to prove you were superior to me that you deliberately blinded yourself to every single financial red flag staring you in the face. You mocked my accounting career. You relentlessly insulted my single lifestyle. You called the rural land a barren dust bowl and laughed out loud at the thought of me struggling to pay the property taxes. Stephanie squeezed her eyes shut tightly, shaking her head back and forth as if she could physically reject the crushing weight of my words. I am sorry. She choked out her voice a ragged, broken whisper. I was wrong, Naomi. I was so wrong about everything. Please save us. Your apologies are just as morally bankrupt as your husband's fake venture capital firm, I stated coldly, showing absolutely zero mercy. You are not actually sorry for the decades of cruelty you inflicted on me. You are not sorry for constantly treating me like a pathetic failure. You are only sorry that the asset you aggressively fought for turned out to be a lethal radioactive liability. You fiercely wanted the Beacon Hill mansion because it was a giant shiny trophy. You wanted to host your shallow friends and loudly brag about your massive inheritance. Well, now you get to host the violent underground syndicate creditors when they arrive at your doorstep to aggressively foreclose on your entire life. You chose Jamal. You chose the fake financial facade. You aggressively demanded the house. You have to live with the catastrophic consequences of your blinding. Relentless greed. Stephanie let out a loud, visceral scream, violently slamming her bare hands against the hardwood floor. But my children, she shrieked, playing her absolute final desperate card. You are their aunt. You have $32 million sitting in an escrow account. Are you really going to let 3 innocent children be thrown out onto the freezing street? I looked down at her with icy detachment. I will establish a heavily guarded trust fund strictly for my nieces and nephews' basic education. However, neither you, Jamal, nor Beatrice will ever see a single cent of it. I picked up my briefcase and walked out the heavy oak doors, leaving them screaming in the ruins of their greed. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind me, instantly, cutting off the frantic, hysterical wailing of my mother and sister. The sudden silence in the reception area was absolute. I walked past the stunned receptionist, giving her a polite, professional nod, and stepped into the waiting elevator. As the polished stainless steel doors slid closed, I looked at my reflection in the cold metal. My posture was perfectly straight. My breathing was slow, measured, and steady. I stepped out of the high-rise corporate building and into the crisp, cool air of downtown Boston. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the intoxicating scent of absolute freedom, the invisible, suffocating chains of familial obligation that had wrapped tightly around my throat for 33 years had finally been shattered into dust. I hailed a yellow cab and directed the driver safely back to my downtown apartment. I pulled out my phone and verified the encrypted bank application one last time, watching the $32 million balance sit perfectly secure. I had a lot of packing to do and a completely new, brilliant life to build from the ground up. The subsequent months played out exactly like a masterclass in brutal, highly realistic karma. Jamal never saw the inside of a luxury corporate boardroom again. The federal prosecutors did not offer him a lenient plea deal or a reduced sentence, thanks to the pristine high-definition hidden camera footage of his violent assault on my dying father, combined with my comprehensive forensic audit of his complex shadow loans. The criminal case against him was an absolute slam dunk. Jamal stood in a federal courtroom permanently stripped of his custom-tailored designer suits and his arrogant, mocking smirk. He was forced to wear standard-issue institutional clothing, his wrists shackled together in front of the judge. The court showed zero mercy to a man who had viciously preyed upon a vulnerable, terminally ill relative simply to fund a fraudulent, lavish lifestyle. The judge slammed the gavel down, delivering a mandatory 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for mortgage fraud, bank fraud, and severe elder abuse. His fake venture capital firm was formally liquidated by the state, exposing him to his former high society friends as nothing more than a desperate predatory con artist. He was permanently banned from the financial sector, his reputation entirely and irrevocably incinerated. Stephanie and Beatrice faced a daily devastation that was entirely of their own making. The underground syndicate did not care about Stephanie's manufactured tears or my mother's perceived country club status. The exact second the acceleration clause triggered, the shadow creditors aggressively foreclosed on the Beacon Hill mansion. The seizure was swift, ruthless, and incredibly public. Stephanie's wealthy neighbors watched from their manicured lawns as aggressive collection agents towed away her luxury SUVs and hauled her expensive designer furniture out the front door to cover the immediate penalties. The elite country club immediately revoked their family memberships due to unpaid monthly dues and the highly toxic public scandal surrounding Jamal's high-profile arrest. Stripped of the massive mansion, the expensive cars, and their beloved social standing, the two women who had mercilessly mocked my rented apartment were violently forced into actual poverty. Stephanie and Beatrice had to pack whatever meager belongings they had left and move into a cramped, severely outdated Section 8 housing apartment on the extreme, undesirable outskirts of the city. There were no more Michelin-star dinners or expensive charity galas. They were permanently trapped in a tiny linoleum-floored unit with peeling wallpaper and noisy radiators, forced to live together and bitterly blame each other for the catastrophic greed that had completely destroyed their lives. I kept my strict promise regarding my nieces and nephews. I established an ironclad, heavily guarded educational trust fund managed by an independent, ruthless third-party fiduciary. The trust paid directly to their private schools and covered their essential health care, ensuring the children would not suffer for their parents' massive crimes. But Stephanie and Beatrice never saw a single cent of that $32 million fortune. They were permanently locked out legally and financially cut off from my existence forever. As they sank into the miserable, suffocating reality, they had engineered my life expanded into something brilliant, powerful, and absolutely limitless. The $32 million payout from the tech conglomerate cleared perfectly into my secured corporate accounts, generating massive daily interest. I did not buy a flashy mansion or an exotic sports car to show off to superficial neighbors. I used the massive capital to elevate my career to heights my family had confidently claimed I could never reach. I relocated to New York City and leased a sleek high-rise corner office in Manhattan with stunning floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire bustling skyline. I rapidly expanded my forensic accounting practice, hiring a dedicated team of elite, highly trained investigators to track down corporate fraud and aggressively dismantle predatory financial schemes worldwide. I sat at my massive glass desk drinking premium coffee, reviewing complex audit files from massive Fortune 500 clients who respected my intellect and paid top dollar for my expertise. I was thriving in every possible metric. I was completely financially independent. I was utterly free from the toxic family ties that had actively tried to drag me down into the dirt for over 3 decades. I had built my powerful empire on pure intellect, undeniable truth, and absolute unforgiving boundaries. I turned away from the breathtaking view of the city and looked directly into the camera. Have you ever had a family member demand you sacrifice your future to fund their mistakes? How did you draw the line? Let me know in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the best revenge is simply letting toxic people destroy themselves. The harrowing saga of Naomi and her deeply toxic family serves as a powerful testament to the absolute necessity of establishing ironclad personal boundaries. For far too long, society has peddled the narrative that familial loyalty must be unconditional, often weaponizing the phrase, "blood is thicker than water," to excuse manipulative parasitic behavior. In Naomi's story, we see this toxic entitlement laid bare: a sister, mother, and brother-in-law who were perfectly willing to hurl her into federal prison and financial ruin just to maintain their fragile, fraudulent suburban empire. The crucial lesson here is that sharing DNA does not ever obligate you to become collateral damage for someone else's catastrophic greed or massive ego. Naomi's ultimate victory was not merely about securing a staggering multi-million-dollar corporate payout. It was fundamentally about the quiet, grueling work she did in the shadows to build her own unshakable independence. By relying strictly on her intellect, her professional skills, and her unyielding composure, she completely immunized herself against decades of emotional blackmail. When her family demanded she set her own future on fire just to keep them warm, she possessed the clarity and the leverage to simply walk away. Her journey teaches us that true emotional freedom requires us to stop desperately seeking validation from those who are fiercely committed to misunderstanding and belittling us, instead of absorbing their cruelty. We must step back and let the natural, brutal consequences of their own actions take hold. We often trap ourselves in endless cycles of abuse because we falsely hope our abusers will eventually recognize our worth. Naomi's triumph proves that your value is inherent, and you do not need permission to succeed. Take a hard look at your own relationships today, and dare to draw the firm boundaries you need to protect your peace and your future.